Hello, in this video I'm going to show you how to get started with Couchbase in ASP.NET Core. For getting started with ASP.NET, check out my previous video. And much of this material will be very similar repeat to what I showed you in part 1 on ASP.NET, but there are enough differences, both major and minor, to warrant this separate video. The differences are mainly in ASP.NET versus ASP.NET Core, not in the Couchbase.NET SDK. So I'll be creating a basic CRUD HTTP API, and CRUD stands for Create, Read, Update, Delete. This API will be operating on a gift wish list, all the items I want you to buy me for Christmas. I won't be building a UI, but you could use this API with something like Angular or React or Aurelia, etc. I'll be using Visual Studio 2017. I'm also using Couchbase Server 5.0 Community Edition, which is already installed. Everything should work for Enterprise Edition as well. I've created one bucket called Demo. I've also created one user with full access to the bucket called My User, which has a password of password. Let's get started with ASP.NET. So I'm going to go to File, New, Project. This is like .NET Core on the left side here under Visual C#. And I'll select ASP.NET Core Web Application. And I'll call this one Video Part 2. Okay. In this dialog here, notice that I've selected ASP.NET Core 2.0, and I'll click just Web API, and OK. This creates a basic shell site. As you can see here, all the files that it created for us. While we're at it, let's go ahead and add the Couchbase.NET SDK with NuGet. So I'll just browse for Couchbase Net Client, and there it is. Install. While that's installing, I just want to go over how Couchbase SDK works. It allows us to connect to a Couchbase cluster. And Couchbase is a distributed database, so typically there are several servers called nodes in a group called a cluster. And they all act together. And a cluster has one or more buckets, which are collections of documents. A bucket is distributed amongst the nodes in the cluster, but it's treated as a single logical entity by the SDK. Within a bucket, each document has a unique key and a JSON value. Now for this video, my cluster only has a single node and a single bucket. In production, you'll typically have at least 3 and possibly hundreds of nodes and possibly a few buckets. Let's go back over here now that the SDK is installed, and let's write some code in the ASP.NET Core application to connect to the cluster. So let's go to startup.cs. In startup.cs, I will go into the configure services method here, and I'll use the cluster helper, which is part of the .NET SDK. Cluster helper.initialize, and I'll pass in a new client configuration to that. There's lots of options here, but all I need for this video is servers. I'll do a new list of URIs, and I only have the one node running locally, so I'm just going to list that one, localhost. And I also need to supply this with the credentials. So we'll say new password authenticator, it's my user, and a password of password. You don't have to use Cluster Helper, but it is an easy, convenient way to get started and manage the cluster object for you. Now when the application ends, I want to release any resources that the cluster is using. Typically a cluster is instantiated one time. It's an expensive operation to create a cluster object, so it's done one time in your application. And you also want to make sure to release any of the resources that the cluster is holding on to when the application itself closes. To do that in ASP.NET Core, let's go to the configure method here. And this is one way to do it. We'll add in an iApplication lifetime parameter to this method. And we can register code to happen on lifetime events. One of them is application stopped. So down here we'll say application lifetime .application stopped, and we'll register some code to run when that happens. And all we need to do is say, since we're using cluster helper, we can just say cluster helper.close. Oops, I forgot the arrow over here. There we go. So from this point on, I can use cluster helper to get a bucket object. And the bucket is what I'm going to use to do all the CRUD operations. I'm going to be using cluster helper directly, but I would suggest you also check out the Couchbase dependency injection component to manage this instead. And you can find a link in the blog post in the video description. Okay, so let's go and create a controller here. And it did this values controller for us. We'll just delete that. We don't need that controller there. So I'll add a new class here. We'll call it gifts controller. And this will inherit from the controller base class. So this is one difference between ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core, is that there's just one controller base class. There's no API controller base class. And then in the constructor, I will just get a bucket object from cluster helper. And I'll say get bucket, and it was called demo. I'll make this a field in the class. So now we have this bucket object that we can use to do the CRUD operations. Now before we start actually doing that, let's think about the model a little bit. So let's create a model folder here. And we're just going to model one very simple thing. We'll call it wishlist item. So let's think about how we want to model this in our documents. The document's going to have a key. So each document has a key. So we can use a GUID for that key. We could use something more meaningful if we wanted to, but we're just going to keep it simple and make it a GUID for today. And each item on that wish list is going to have a name. So this is going to be a description of the thing that I want as a gift. So this is just going to be a string. And another thing we might want to model is that a Couchbase bucket can contain documents of all kinds. So it's a good idea to differentiate documents in case we add more kinds of documents in the future. One way to do that is we can give each document a field like type, and that's just going to contain a string that's always going to be wish list item. So let's finish up this class here to actually represent an item. So we have a GUID. I'm going to make it nullable, and I'll explain why later. And then we'll need a string for the name of the item. And we'll need a type. So one way we could do this is we could just return wishlist item as a hard-coded string, and there might be a good reason to do that. Another thing we could do, and let's just change this to the newer C# syntax. We could also use a bit of reflection here and say, okay, type of wishlist item, and get the name from the type itself. And so this approach, if we refactor this or rename the class to something else, it will change the type string accordingly. And there are some trade-offs to that. So use whatever works in your use case. So we have the model down here. It's just a really simple model with an ID, a name, and a type. Let's go ahead and prime the database with a couple of wishlist items. We'll do that in the Couchbase console itself. So we'll go to the demo bucket here. Currently there's no documents in this bucket. So we'll add a document, and we'll give it some GUID here. And it generates some JSON for us, but we're going to make it our wishlist item. So we'll say name, and it'll be Nintendo Switch, the first thing I want. And we'll give it a type of wishlist item. This matches our model. So we'll go ahead and save. So now we have one document in the bucket. Let's add another one. And we'll give it a different GUID here. They have to be unique. And this one's going to have the same field, so name. It's going to have a, let's say, monoprice 3D printer. That would be nice. And the same type. So we save. And now we have two documents in the bucket. And this should be the only time I'll have to enter documents into Couchbase directly in this video. Let's go back over to our ASP.NET. And let's start by creating a simple endpoint that's going to get all the items on the list. So this will be a get endpoint. And we'll specify the route of API get all. Sounds good. And this is going to be returning I action result. And we'll call it get all. No parameters necessary. It's just going to return every wishlist item. And the easiest way to do this is in Couchbase is to write a nickel query, which is SQL for JSON, supported by Couchbase. So let's go over to the console here and go to the query workbench and try out a query to get all the items of the wish list. We have 2 entered so far. So we'll just write a select g.star, G for gifts. From the demo bucket, we'll alias that as G. And we'll say, just give me all the documents where the type is wish list item. The other thing I want to do here is I want to get the ID of the document itself. In Couchbase, that's not included in the document. It's metadata about the document. So I'll use the meta keyword here to get the ID, or the key of the document. So I'll execute this, and the query is going to fail because there's no matching index. We could just go ahead and create a primary index here, but that's not going to give us the best performance. So let's create a more specific index just on the type field itself. So we'll create index, we'll call it ix type on the demo bucket, and we're just going to index the type field itself. So go ahead and create that index. Okay, that's done. We'll go back to the original query, execute this, and now we have a successful query that's returning the 2 items on my wish list right now. So let's take that query and go back over to ASP.NET, and we will paste that in here as a string. And we'll clean this up a little bit. Oops, I forgot an equal sign. All right, and now let's take that string and create a query object using query request.create, passing in the string itself. We could enter parameters here by saying query.add named parameter or query.add positional parameter, but there are no queries in this. There are no parameters in this query, so we don't need to do that. But one thing I will do is I'll set a scan consistency of request plus. And I'm not going to go into much detail about this, so please check out the documentation. The short version is that this will give us the most complete results, but the trade-off is a bit of a performance penalty. And for this small demo application, we won't even notice that. And finally, at the end, we have, we want to get the result. So we'll say bucket.query, and it's going to take the results of this query and put them into the type that we specify, which is going to be wish list item. I'll pass in the query there. So now this result object has things like if there was an exception, was it successful or not, any messages, and what are the actual results. So we'll just return the results directly. We're going to eschew any sort of exception handling or anything like that, and just return the results, which are in this rows field, which you can see is a list of wish list item. So it's those JSON documents that have been serialized into C# wish list item objects. Now we could compile and try this endpoint directly in the browser, or we could try it out with Fiddler or Postman. I'm going to show you how to add Swagger because it's super easy to do, and Swagger is automatically generated tooling / documentation for HTTP APIs like the one we're building. So we're going to start by adding the swashbuckle package from NuGet. It's swashbuckle.ASP.NET Core. So go ahead and install that. So once that's installed, we have to go back over to Startup here. In Configure Services, we're going to add a bit of code here. We're going to say up here services.add swagger gen, and we'll give this a function here. And we're going to say c.swagger.doc, and we'll give it a version 1. We'll just call it version 1, and we'll pass in this info object, which can give us some more information about how to generate the Swagger. We can give it a title, like gift wish list API, and we can specify a version if you want to do versioning, like v1. Okay, and then down in configure, this is typically the pattern you have to see when you're using ASP.NET Core. You configure the service up here, and then you actually configure to use the thing down here. So use Swagger. That's typically the pattern we're going to do. Services.add and then app.use. You see that a lot in ASP.NET Core. And beyond that, we want to actually use the Swagger UI, which is another command. We'll give a lambda 2, c.swagger endpoint, and it's going to consume. This is the URL that the Swagger use Swagger will generate. It will generate some JSON for us. And we'll again say GIF wishlist API. And so this command here is going to actually generate the Swagger UI for us, interactive UI, and that's going to take place, that's going to be at the /swagger URL. So it'll be something like localhost/swagger. Okay, and so what we can do then is we can go over here to properties, launch settings, and instead of the API values, which is the default, we're just going to replace it with, oops, not that, we're going to replace it with Swagger. Here and here. May as well do it in both places. So when we launch this application, it's going to take us immediately to the Swagger UI. Okay, so now we can launch it, and hopefully it'll show us the Swagger UI here in the browser. And it does. And you can see we just have the one endpoint, the get all that we created. So I'll click on that and expand it. And Swagger generates this way for us to try it right here in the browser directly. And there's no parameters or anything, so it's just a try it out button. So we'll go ahead and click that, and we'll get back the results. It'll tell us how to generate this in curl if we wanted to, what URL it's using. This is what actually got back as a response in the body. This is the code we used OK, so it's going to give us a 200 code, and also some headers as well. You can see powered by ASP.NET on the Kestrel server, and so on. This is a really handy way to test out your endpoints and also to document them to some extent. Let's create another endpoint. Back over to Visual Studio here in the GIFs controller. And we'll create an endpoint to get a single item from the wish list based on the key. This will be helpful when creating an edit form in your web app, for instance. So again, it's going to be a get. Will be a route, and we'll say API/get, and we'll pass an ID token here. That's going to get replaced. And action result again. We'll do a get and a GUID ID. Now, inside this code, we actually could use nickel again, but it's going to be faster to use a get operation since we already know the key. So we'll just say var result equals bucket.get, again into a wishlist item object, and we'll pass in the key here. So it's going to be ID, and Couchbase wants a string, so we pass in 2 string there. And the result object, again, is going to have information about whether it was successful or not, what the exception messages were, etc. All we're interested in right now is returning an OK of the result.value, which you can see is of a wish list item. So Control F5. And we see with Swagger, again, we have 2 endpoints now, and one of them expects this token, this ID token, which we can actually pass in there. So let's first get a list of all of them. So here's the Nintendo Switch key here. We'll copy that over to here, paste this in, and I try it out. We should expect to see the Nintendo Switch item, and we do. So next, let's create an endpoint to deal with creating and updating. So I'm going to call this an HTTP post endpoint. Now there's some arguments that say you should use a post for a new one and a put for an update. I'm going to combine them both into one and use a post here. Again, you're free to do whatever fits your use case the best. And we're just going to call this one edit. And we expect there to be a wish list item passed in here being posted by Swagger or by Angular or whatever the case may be. With ASP.NET Core, you're going to want to specify that this is going to come from the body. So it's going to be a JSON object we're going to post from the body there. And once again, we could use nickel to do the actual insert or update, but it's going to be faster and easier to use an upsert operation. An upsert is going to create a new document if it doesn't already exist, or replace an existing document if it does. So to handle the case where we're creating a new wish list item, we would not expect the item ID to be set. It's going to be null. That's why I made it nullable earlier. So we want to check for that. So if it is not the case that item ID has value, then go ahead and set it to some new GUID. So at this point in the code, we know that the item object is going to have a GUID set no matter what. So we can go ahead and use the bucket to do an upsert operation using item.id, and again 2 string, as the key. and then we'll pass in some object that's going to get serialized to JSON. Now, we could pass in this item here directly, and that would be serialized to JSON. But there are some risks in doing that. And if wishlist item gets changed or new fields get added, you may not want to actually save those to the database. So I'm going to do an explicit mapping here that just says we're going to create a new anonymous object with name. It's going to be mapped from the item.name, and we'll also bring over the type from item.type. And again, remember, this is hard-coded using reflection. If you're doing something different, you may want to consider hard-coding the type here instead. That's really going to depend on your use case and how you want to architect your application. Okay, and we'll just go ahead and return an OK of the item itself, and that ought to do it for both adds and edits. Also notice I've left out validation on all these endpoints, checking to see that the name is not null or empty, for instance. I'm leaving that as an exercise to you to accomplish. It's not really crucial for this demonstration. So let's go ahead and bring this up in Swagger here. We see a new endpoint. It's a post endpoint. Bring that up here. And one cool thing about Swagger when we're doing post is that it's going to generate sort of a shell of an example value that is going to be posted based on that wishlist item class. So let's start by updating an existing wishlist item. So let's find one first. Let's try it out here. And okay, Nintendo Switch is this key here. So I'll go over back to the edit, and we'll click this, and it'll copy it over into the parameter here. So that's the ID for the Nintendo Switch. And I changed my mind. I want it to be an SNES Classic edition instead of the Nintendo Switch. So as we know from the code, it's only going to look at the name field that's being passed in. It's only going to look at the ID. It's going to basically ignore this type. So we could change this type to wherever we want to. Foo-bar-baz. It's going to be ignored. We could add other fields here that are also going to be ignored. So then I'll go ahead and take this and we'll try it out. We're going to post that to the endpoint. And you can see that we get the response back. It actually has an ID with the SNES Classic, and the type is wishlist item. Despite my attempt to change it to some other type, it's ignored that. If I go back over here to get all and try it out, you can see that, in fact, it has been updated, SNES Classic Edition. Now let's go ahead and use this endpoint to create a new item on the wish list. So let's pass in a, we're not going to pass an ID. It's going to create one for us. We're assuming this is a brand new object. And let's go ahead and enter Yankee Candle Balsam, which is my favorite scent. And again, I can specify a type or literally any other fields I want to. They're going to be ignored. It's just going to be ID and name. So go ahead and try this out. And it's been successfully posted. And you can see the new ID that's generated here. Yankee Candle. I go back up to Get All. Try it out. And I have 3 items on my wish list. SNES Classic and Yankee Candle are the ones we added with this endpoint. Okay, let's go back over here. We need one more to finish out the CRUD. We need a delete endpoint. So we'll call this one HTTP delete, and we'll give it a route of API/delete and ID token. Again, action results, delete, and we just want the ID being passed in here based on the URL. Again, we could use nickel, but it's going to be faster to use the delete since we already know the key. And again, no validation here. So we're not checking to see if it actually exists. We're not checking to see if they're allowed to delete it, anything like that. We're just going to go ahead and perform the remove operation. Bucket.remove, ID, and toString. And we'll return an OK of just the ID. We'll be fine. Whoops. Lowercase r. All right, so let's try this in Swagger. So I'll get all here just to see all my whole list is here. I've changed my mind. I can't find the SNES Classic at the price I want to, so I'm going to delete it off the list here. So we'll open up the delete endpoint. It needs one parameter. We'll paste in the GUID for the SNES Classic. We'll try it out. It was successful. It deleted that item. Go back up here to get all. Try it out again, and we're down to just 2 items on my wish list. So now you have full CRUD capabilities and basic Couchbase connectivity from your ASP.NET application. For more interesting stuff you can do with Couchbase and .NET Core, check out blog.couchbase.com. Thank you for watching.